The joke's over, so is the marriage. That's what I left written on our granite kitchen counter the morning I walked away from 8 years with Vivian, and I meant every word of it. I guess I should start from the beginning, from that Tuesday night when everything I thought I knew about my wife came crashing down around me like a house of cards in a windstorm. I'm Marcus, 34, been working security at TechCore Solutions in Tucson for the past 6 years, mostly overnight shifts watching over servers and equipment that cost more than my annual salary. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, honest, and it gave Vivian and me enough to afford our downtown Phoenix condo with its granite countertops and city view that she loved posting about on social media. I'd been pulling 12-hour shifts that week, coming home exhausted at 7 in the morning, usually finding Vivian already at her insurance company job or getting ready for one of those morning yoga classes she'd started attending religiously about 3 months earlier. That particular Tuesday, I finished my rounds early and decided to surprise her by coming home with coffee from that expensive place she always talked about but complained was too far from her office. I used my key as quietly as possible, thinking maybe we could have breakfast together before I crashed for a few hours, but as I stepped into our living room, I heard her voice drifting from the bedroom, bright and animated in a way that made me pause with the coffee cups still in my hands. She was giggling, actually giggling, in this sweet, flirtatious tone I hadn't heard directed at me in months, and through the partially open door, I could see her sitting cross-legged on our bed with her laptop, wearing the blue dress she usually reserved for our rare date nights and with her hair done in those loose waves she spent an hour perfecting. She was saying something about how funny Landon was, how he totally understood her sense of humor, and how nice it was to finally have someone at work who actually listened to what she had to say, unlike some people who were always too tired to have real conversations anymore. I set the coffee down on our kitchen counter with hands that had started trembling slightly, not from anger yet, but from this cold recognition that was spreading through my chest like ice water. I'd been working my ass off to keep us comfortable, picking up extra shifts whenever possible, coming home dead tired but still trying to be present for her, still asking about her day even when my eyes were burning from staring at security monitors for 12 straight hours. Apparently, while I was ensuring our financial stability, she'd found someone at work who had the energy to appreciate her personality, someone who made workplace soulmate jokes about their shared hatred of the new coffee machine, someone who had time for extended lunch breaks that had been lasting increasingly longer according to the calendar notifications I'd glimpsed on her phone. I stood in that kitchen for probably 10 minutes, just listening to her laugh and talk about team-building exercises that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency, about inside jokes she shared with this Landon character, about how refreshing it was to connect with someone on an intellectual level. The worst part wasn't the flirtation in her voice or even the obvious emotional intimacy she was building with another man, it was the casual way she dismissed our relationship, complaining that I was always so tired anyway, like my exhaustion was some character flaw rather than the natural result of working night shifts to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to expecting. When she finally ended the call and emerged from the bedroom, she jumped slightly at seeing me standing there with 2 cups of what was now lukewarm coffee, and for just a split second, I saw something flicker across her face that looked almost like guilt before she composed herself and smiled that bright, innocent smile that had first attracted me to her 8 years earlier. She asked what I was doing home so early, if everything was okay at work, and I told her I'd wanted to surprise her with coffee, watching carefully as relief replaced the momentary tension in her shoulders, as if she'd been worried I might have overheard something I shouldn't have. That evening, after she'd gone to her book club meeting that now seemed conveniently timed with my work schedule, I did something I'd never done before in our entire relationship. I looked through her tablet while she was gone. I'm not proud of that invasion of privacy, but something in my gut was telling me that the conversation I'd partially overheard was just the tip of an iceberg I needed to understand fully before it sank what was left of our marriage. What I found in her message history with Landon made my hands shake with a mixture of rage and disappointment that I'd never experienced before, pages of flirtatious exchanges that had been building for weeks, compliments about each other's appearance and personality, jokes about being each other's work spouse, and worst of all, conversations about me that painted me as this boring, inattentive husband who didn't understand her needs the way Landon apparently did. She'd been sharing intimate details about our relationship, complaining about my work schedule, my tiredness, even joking about how I fell asleep watching movies she wanted us to enjoy together, as if my physical exhaustion from working to support us both was somehow evidence that I didn't care about her emotional needs. There were messages about how exciting it was to feel appreciated again, about how nice it was to have someone who made her feel attractive and interesting, about how she'd forgotten what it was like to have stimulating conversations with someone who was actually awake enough to engage with her thoughts and feelings. I sat there in our living room, surrounded by the furniture we'd chosen together, the artwork we'd bought on vacation, the life we'd built over 8 years, and realized that while I'd been working night shifts to maintain our comfortable lifestyle, she'd been building an emotional affair with a coworker who had the luxury of normal business hours and the energy that came with 8 hours of sleep each night. The betrayal wasn't just in the obvious attraction and emotional intimacy she was developing with another man, it was in how completely she'd dismissed my sacrifices, how thoroughly she'd rewritten our relationship narrative to justify her growing connection with someone else, how easily she'd shared our private struggles with a man who was slowly replacing me in the most important aspects of her emotional life. I didn't sleep that night, and for once it had nothing to do with my work schedule. Instead, I lay there next to Vivian, listening to her breathe peacefully while my mind raced through 8 years of memories, trying to figure out when exactly I'd become the villain in my own marriage story and when this Landon character had started positioning himself as her emotional rescue operation. By 4 a.m, I'd made my decision with the kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stop making excuses for someone else's behavior and start protecting yourself from further damage. I wasn't going to confront her, wasn't going to give her the opportunity to gaslight me or minimize what I'd discovered, wasn't going to sit through some painful conversation where she tried to convince me that her emotional affair was somehow my fault for working too much or not being emotionally available enough. Instead, I was going to do what any smart person does when they realize their investment is failing: cut their losses quickly and decisively before things got worse. At 5:30, while Vivian was still sleeping, I called my gym buddy Ryan, knowing he'd be up getting ready for his construction job and knowing he'd understand the urgency in my voice when I asked if he could help me move some stuff that morning. Ryan and I had been friends since high school, and he'd seen me through enough life changes to know that when I made a decision, I'd already thought it through from every possible angle. So when I told him I needed to be completely moved out before Vivian got home from work, he didn't ask questions, just said he'd pick up his truck and meet me at the condo by 7. The methodical part of my brain kicked in, the same systematic thinking that made me good at security work, and I started planning the logistics of extracting myself from 8 years of shared life with military precision. First, I called the bank and transferred exactly half of our joint savings account into my personal checking account, a total of $14,000 that represented years of careful budgeting and my overtime hours, money I'd earned and had every legal right to claim as community property in Arizona. Then I contacted our property management company and formally removed my name from the lease on our downtown condo, something I could do unilaterally since we were both on the original agreement, effectively making the remainder of the lease entirely Vivian's financial responsibility. I spent the next hour systematically packing only my belongings: clothes, books, my guitar, the tools I'd accumulated over the years, my computer equipment, and the few personal items that predated our relationship, leaving behind everything we'd bought together because I wanted a clean break with no lingering financial entanglements or reasons for future contact. By the time Ryan arrived with his pickup truck, I had everything sorted into boxes and garbage bags, and we worked in efficient silence to load 8 years of my life into the back of his Ford F-150, making multiple trips to a storage unit I'd rented online using my phone while Vivian was still sleeping. The whole operation took less than 4 hours, and by 11 o'clock, every trace of my presence had been systematically removed from the condo except for the note I left on our granite kitchen counter next to her favorite coffee mug, the one with the motivational quote about living your best life that now seemed ironically appropriate. The note was deliberately brief and cutting, designed to make it clear that I knew exactly what had been going on and wasn't interested in explanations or apologies. The joke's over. So is the marriage. Divorce papers will be coming soon. Don't contact me. I'd considered writing something longer, maybe explaining how hurt and disappointed I was, maybe detailing everything I'd discovered about her relationship with Landon, but I realized that would just give her ammunition to turn this situation into something that was somehow my fault, some failure on my part to communicate or understand her needs. Instead, I chose the power of brevity, leaving her to fill in the blanks and wonder exactly how much I knew, exactly when I'd figured it out, exactly how long I'd been planning this exit strategy while she thought she was being clever and discreet with her workplace romance. By noon, I was checked into a weekly rate hotel near the industrial district where I worked, a clean, no-frills place that charged $200 a week and didn't require a long-term commitment or credit check. Perfect for someone who needed time to figure out his next move without being locked into another lease or mortgage situation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now living closer to my workplace than I had in years, that my commute had been cut from 45 minutes to 10, that I could actually walk to work if I wanted to, benefits of my situation that Vivian would probably never understand because she'd never considered how her lifestyle preferences had affected my daily routine. I spent that first afternoon setting up my temporary living space with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make the most of small spaces during my years in the military before I'd met Vivian, arranging my belongings in a way that felt functional rather than decorative, focusing on practical concerns rather than aesthetic ones. The hotel room had everything I actually needed: a bed, a desk, a small refrigerator, a coffee maker, and most importantly, complete peace of mind knowing that I was no longer financially supporting someone who'd been emotionally cheating on me while complaining about my work schedule to her affair partner. That evening, I sat in my hotel room eating takeout Chinese food and realized I felt better than I had in months, not because I was happy about my marriage ending, but because I'd finally stopped pretending that working harder or being more understanding was going to fix a relationship where my partner had already checked out emotionally and started investing her energy in someone else. My phone stayed silent all day, which meant Vivian hadn't come home yet to discover my departure, and I used those quiet hours to research divorce attorneys and start preparing for what I knew would be her inevitable attempts to contact me once she realized that her comfortable lifestyle had just evaporated along with her husband. The explosion came at exactly 6:47 that evening, my phone lighting up with the first of what would become 37 missed calls in the span of 3 hours. I was sitting in my hotel room, having just finished a decent burger from the diner next door, when Vivian's name started flashing on my screen with the frantic persistence of someone who just discovered that her safety net had been pulled out from under her without warning. I let every single call go to voicemail, watching the number climb as she cycled between panic, anger, and what I assumed was desperate confusion about how I'd managed to vanish so completely while she was out living her best life. The voicemails started coherent enough, with her demanding to know where I was and what I thought I was doing, but by the 10th message, her voice had taken on that high-pitched quality she got when she couldn't control a situation, when reality wasn't bending to her expectations the way it usually did. She'd enlisted our mutual friends Claire and David by the 15th call, having them reach out to me with messages about how worried she was, how she just wanted to talk, how she was sure we could work this out if I'd just come home and discuss things like adults. The irony of her wanting to discuss things like adults wasn't lost on me, considering she'd been having emotional affairs and complaining about our marriage to another man instead of addressing her concerns directly with me, but I appreciated that our friends were genuinely trying to help even if they didn't understand the full situation. I'd already spent the afternoon researching divorce attorneys online, reading reviews and comparing fees, and had settled on Patricia Chen, a family law specialist with 15 years of experience who specialized in Arizona's no-fault divorce laws and had excellent ratings for handling cases involving infidelity and financial misconduct. Her office was only 20 minutes from my hotel, and when I called her emergency consultation line that evening, she was able to schedule a meeting for the following morning to discuss filing for dissolution of marriage based on irreconcilable differences, which in Arizona meant I wouldn't need to prove Vivian's emotional affair, just demonstrate that our marriage was irretrievably broken. The beauty of Arizona's legal system was that it didn't require lengthy separations or complicated fault determinations, just a straightforward acknowledgement that the marriage couldn't be saved, something I was more than ready to document given what I discovered about her relationship with Landon. By 9 o'clock that night, Vivian had apparently exhausted her contact list of mutual friends and had moved on to more creative communication strategies, including having Claire call me directly with a message about how Vivian was having some kind of panic attack and needed to know I was safe. I finally responded with a brief text to Claire, not to Vivian, explaining that I was fine, that I'd discovered some things about my marriage that made it impossible to continue, and that I'd be filing for divorce through legal channels rather than engaging in emotional dramatics. Claire responded immediately, asking if there was anything she could do, and I appreciated her genuine concern while making it clear that this was between Vivian and me, that I wasn't looking for intermediaries or marriage counselors, that some betrayals were simply too fundamental to repair through conversation. When Vivian finally reached me on the third day, calling from a borrowed phone because I'd already blocked her number, her strategy had shifted from panic to damage control, with her trying to minimize what I discovered by calling it harmless flirting and an overreaction on my part. She claimed that her conversations with Landon were just friendly workplace banter, that I was reading too much into innocent messages between colleagues, that my reaction was disproportionate to what she characterized as minor indiscretions that didn't mean anything serious. I listened to her entire rehearsed explanation with the detached interest of someone observing a fascinating psychological case study, noting how she'd managed to reframe her emotional affair as my misunderstanding, how she'd positioned herself as the victim of my suspicious nature rather than the perpetrator of a betrayal that had been building for months. When she finished her justifications and asked if I was willing to come home so we could work through this misunderstanding like reasonable adults, I calmly informed her that divorce papers were already being prepared by my attorney and that Patricia Chen would be contacting her within the week with formal documentation. The silence on her end stretched for nearly 30 seconds before she started crying, not the manipulative tears she'd used in the past to get her way, but the genuine shock of someone who'd finally realized that her actions had consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. Her attempts to characterize the situation as a misunderstanding only strengthened my conviction that I was making the right decision, that someone who could maintain a months-long emotional relationship with another person and then dismiss it as harmless flirting was exactly the kind of person I needed to divorce as quickly and cleanly as possible. The conversation ended with her begging me to reconsider, promising she'd cut off all contact with Landon, swearing she'd never realized how inappropriate their relationship had become, claiming she'd do anything to save our marriage if I'd just give her another chance to prove her commitment. I told her that the time for proving commitment had passed, that trust once broken couldn't be rebuilt through promises, that I'd already moved on emotionally and legally, and that she should use this experience to figure out what she actually wanted from life instead of trying to maintain multiple emotional relationships simultaneously. 2 weeks after I'd vanished from our shared life, Vivian apparently decided that direct appeals weren't working and shifted to a more manipulative strategy that would have been impressive in its audacity if it hadn't been so transparently desperate. According to Claire, who called me with a mixture of concern and bewilderment, Vivian had convinced Landon to come to the condo that Saturday morning so they could both explain to me how innocent their relationship really was, how I'd misunderstood their workplace friendship, and how my reaction was destroying not just our marriage but also Landon's reputation at their insurance company. The plan, as Claire understood it, was that seeing them together in person would somehow convince me that their connection was purely platonic, that I'd realize my interpretation of their messages had been colored by jealousy and insecurity, and that I'd apologize for my overreaction and agree to marriage counseling to work through my trust issues. I had to admire the sheer psychological manipulation involved in this scheme, the way Vivian had managed to position herself and her affair partner as the victims of my suspicious mind rather than the architects of a betrayal that had been months in the making. Unfortunately for their intervention plan, I'd already anticipated something like this and had used my key to the condo that morning to retrieve the last few items I'd forgotten during my strategic withdrawal, including my good winter coat and the expensive toolkit my father had given me for my last birthday. I spent about 30 minutes in what had been our home, moving through rooms that already felt like they belonged to a stranger, noting how Vivian had rearranged the furniture to erase evidence of my presence and had apparently redecorated with what looked like nervous energy and retail therapy. Before leaving, I sat at our kitchen table and wrote a comprehensive note that detailed every suspicious behavior I'd observed over the past several months, complete with specific dates and times when she'd claimed to be at team-building exercises that had lasted unusually long, when she'd received text messages that made her smile in ways I hadn't seen directed at me in months, when she'd started dressing up for work in ways that seemed designed to impress someone other than her spreadsheet clients. The note was methodical and devastating, laying out a timeline of her emotional affair that would be impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding or coincidence, including specific quotes from the messages I'd found on her tablet about how I was always too tired anyway and how refreshing it was to connect with someone who actually listened to her thoughts and feelings. I made sure to include details about their extended lunch breaks, their private jokes about being workplace soulmates, and the increasingly intimate tone of their conversations about everything from their personal relationships to their hopes and dreams for the future, conversations that should have been happening between us if our marriage had still been functional. The final paragraph of my note addressed Landon directly, pointing out that pursuing a married woman while she complained about her husband was exactly the kind of behavior that could create serious problems for both his professional reputation and his personal integrity, that companies generally frowned on workplace relationships that involved emotional affairs with married colleagues, and that he might want to consider whether someone who would betray an 8-year marriage was the kind of person he wanted to build a relationship with. I left the note prominently displayed on the granite counter where Vivian would be sure to find it, weighted down with her favorite coffee mug, and locked the door behind me for what I knew would be the final time. According to Ryan, who heard about it through his girlfriend who was friends with Claire, Vivian and Landon arrived at the condo around noon, probably expecting to find me there for their planned intervention, only to discover that I'd been and gone, leaving behind a point-by-point breakdown of their inappropriate relationship that made it impossible for them to maintain their fiction of innocent friendship. Ryan said Claire had described the aftermath as absolutely nuclear, with Vivian calling her in tears about how I'd made their relationship sound tawdry and manipulative, how I'd twisted their innocent conversations into something sinister, how unfair it was that I was using their private messages against them when they'd never actually done anything physical together. But the real entertainment came from Landon's reaction, which apparently involved him reading my note and immediately understanding the serious legal and professional implications of what he'd gotten himself into, the possibility that his pursuit of a married coworker could result in workplace harassment complaints, HR investigations, or even civil liability if Vivian's husband decided to pursue legal action for alienation of affection. Landon left the condo that afternoon, according to Claire's second-hand account, after having what sounded like a heated argument with Vivian about how she'd minimized the seriousness of her marriage, how she'd made their relationship sound casual when she was actually married to someone who clearly took wedding vows seriously, how he'd never intended to get involved in a situation that could destroy his career prospects and professional reputation. The confrontation backfired so spectacularly that Vivian ended up losing both her husband and her affair partner in the same afternoon, finding herself completely alone in a condo she could no longer afford, surrounded by furniture that reminded her of the stable life she'd thrown away for the excitement of workplace flirtation and emotional infidelity. Vivian's desperation reached new heights over the following weeks as the reality of her situation became increasingly clear. She was now financially responsible for a downtown Phoenix condo that had required 2 incomes to maintain, professionally isolated from the coworker who'd been her emotional escape route, and legally married to a man who demonstrated he could vanish from her life as efficiently as he'd once supported it. Her attempts to track me down became increasingly frantic and invasive, starting with calls to TechCore Solutions where she tried to convince my supervisor that there was a family emergency requiring my immediate attention, not realizing that I'd already informed my boss about my divorce proceedings and had specifically requested that personal calls be redirected to voicemail. She showed up at Ryan's gym on a Tuesday evening, apparently having remembered him from our wedding 8 years earlier, cornering him after his workout to demand information about my whereabouts and insisting that I was having some kind of breakdown that required intervention from people who cared about my well-being. Ryan, who'd seen my methodical approach to extracting myself from the marriage and understood exactly why I'd made that choice, told her politely but firmly that I was doing fine, that I'd made my decision as a rational adult, and that she should focus on rebuilding her own life rather than trying to manipulate mine through third parties. The signed divorce papers arrived at her condo exactly 6 weeks after I'd disappeared, delivered by a process server who found her in her bathrobe at 2 in the afternoon, apparently having taken time off work to deal with what she described to Claire as the worst period of her entire life. According to the legal documents Patricia Chen had prepared, our marriage would be officially dissolved in 60 days unless Vivian chose to contest the proceedings, which would require her to hire her own attorney and demonstrate grounds for reconciliation, something that seemed unlikely given the evidence I'd already compiled about her emotional affair with Landon. The division of assets was straightforward under Arizona's community property laws. She could keep the condo if she could qualify for the mortgage on her insurance company's salary alone. I'd already claimed my half of our savings, and our remaining shared debts would be split proportionally based on our respective incomes, leaving her responsible for about 60% of our credit card balances. The bitter final text message she sent me through a new phone number she'd apparently acquired just to bypass my blocks revealed the depth of her denial about the situation, threatening that I'd regret throwing away 8 years for nothing, that I was making a huge mistake over what she still characterized as innocent workplace friendships, that I'd never find anyone who understood me the way she did, and that I'd come crawling back within 6 months begging for another chance. I screenshot the message for my attorney and then blocked that number as well, noting how even in her final communication, she was still trying to rewrite history and position herself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations rather than the architect of our marriage's destruction. Meanwhile, through the reliable intelligence network of mutual friends and workplace gossip, I learned that Landon had been quietly transferred to a different department at their insurance company, effectively ending any possibility of continuing their workplace romance, and was actively avoiding Vivian in company settings, having apparently realized that his career prospects were more important than pursuing a married woman who demonstrated her willingness to betray long-term commitments. Ryan reported that Claire had mentioned Vivian was struggling to make the condo payments on her single income, that she'd started working extra hours and weekends to cover expenses that had previously been shared, and that she'd been forced to give up the yoga classes, expensive coffee habits, and designer clothing purchases that had been part of the lifestyle I'd subsidized through my security guard overtime hours. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on me. She'd complained for months about my work schedule and how tired I was from pulling overtime shifts, but now she was discovering exactly why those extra hours had been necessary to maintain the comfortable lifestyle she'd taken for granted while building emotional connections with someone else. The most satisfying piece of information came through David, who worked in the same building as Vivian's insurance company and had observed Landon's engagement announcement to someone from the accounting department, a development that apparently happened within 3 months of his intervention attempt at our condo and suggested that his workplace soulmate connection with Vivian had been significantly less meaningful than she'd believed. I felt genuinely indifferent when I received this news, not because I was trying to be mature or take the high road, but because I'd already moved so far beyond caring about Vivian's emotional state that her disappointments and betrayals felt like events happening to strangers in a soap opera I'd stopped watching months earlier. 6 months after I'd walked away from our marriage, I received one final legal document, the decree of dissolution officially ending our 8-year union, signed by a Maricopa County judge and making our divorce as final and irreversible as the emotional affair that had precipitated it, closing a chapter of my life that had taught me valuable lessons about trust, self-respect, and the importance of paying attention when someone shows you who they really are through their actions rather than their words. 8 months post-divorce, I was living a life so fundamentally different from my marriage that I sometimes had to remind myself that the man who'd once worked overtime to subsidize Vivian's lifestyle had actually been me rather than some character from a cautionary tale about financial and emotional manipulation. My supervisor at TechCore Solutions had offered me the head of security operations position after our previous manager retired, a promotion that came with a 30% salary increase and the opportunity to work primarily day shifts for the first time in 6 years, finally allowing me to have something resembling a normal social schedule. I'd found a small house in Tempe with a 2-car garage that I'd converted into a workshop where I could pursue woodworking and motorcycle restoration, hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage because Vivian had complained about the noise and the mess, apparently preferring that I spend my free time watching her scroll through social media or listening to her complain about coworkers who weren't appreciating her contributions properly. The house wasn't impressive by magazine standards, but it was mine, paid for with a mortgage I could easily handle on my new salary, furnished with pieces I'd chosen based on comfort and functionality rather than how they'd look in Instagram photos, a space that felt peaceful in ways our downtown condo never had despite its granite countertops and city views. I'd also started taking evening classes in computer networking at the community college, something I'd mentioned wanting to do during my marriage but had never pursued because my work schedule and Vivian's social calendar had made it impossible to commit to regular class attendance, and I was discovering that I had both the aptitude and passion for cybersecurity that could open up entirely new career possibilities. The biggest change in my life was Holly, a librarian I'd met at an amateur astronomy club meeting that Ryan had dragged me to on a whim, thinking I needed to get out and meet people instead of spending all my free time in my workshop or studying networking protocols. Holly was everything Vivian hadn't been, genuinely interested in learning about other people's passions rather than just waiting for her turn to talk, financially independent and responsible with her own savings account and retirement planning, and comfortable with quiet evenings that didn't require expensive entertainment or constant social media documentation. She appreciated my straightforward communication style, something Vivian had criticized as boring and unromantic, and shared my interest in stargazing, often bringing her own telescope to our weekend camping trips where we'd spend hours identifying constellations and talking about everything from science to philosophy to our hopes for the future. Through Claire, who'd maintained her friendship with Vivian despite obvious disapproval of how the divorce had unfolded, I learned that my ex-wife's situation had continued deteriorating in predictable ways that would have made me feel sorry for her if I hadn't remembered exactly how she treated me during the final months of our marriage. Vivian had been forced to move back in with her parents after defaulting on the condo mortgage, apparently unable to manage the payments on her insurance company's salary even with the overtime hours she'd started working to cover expenses she'd never had to budget for during our marriage. Her parents lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood about an hour outside Phoenix, a significant downgrade from the downtown lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to and had apparently taken for granted until she was forced to pay for it herself. According to Claire's carefully neutral updates, Vivian had also discovered that Landon was engaged to someone from the accounting department, a development that had happened with surprising speed and suggested that his emotional connection to her had been significantly more casual than she'd believed when she was risking her marriage for workplace romance and late-night text conversations. The news that her affair partner had moved on so quickly apparently hit her harder than the divorce itself, confirming what I'd suspected all along, that she'd built up their relationship in her mind as something more meaningful and lasting than it had actually been, that she'd traded a stable 8-year marriage for what turned out to be a temporary workplace flirtation with someone who'd never intended to leave his career prospects for someone else's marital drama. When I accidentally encountered Vivian at a grocery store near my old neighborhood, probably 9 months after our final legal paperwork had been processed, I was genuinely surprised by how little I felt seeing her again. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, wearing the kind of discount store clothing she used to mock when we'd see other people shopping in similar outfits, and she was clearly struggling with groceries she was carefully selecting based on price rather than preference. We made brief eye contact across the produce section, and for a moment I thought she might approach me, might try to restart some kind of conversation about our shared past or her current difficulties, but instead she looked away quickly and moved to a different part of the store, apparently as eager to avoid interaction as I was. The encounter left me feeling nothing more than mild curiosity about how she was adapting to her new circumstances, the same detached interest I might feel reading about a stranger's life changes in a news article, and I realized that my anger had evolved into complete emotional neutrality, that she'd become someone who'd once been important to me rather than someone who still had any power to affect my happiness or peace of mind. A full year after walking away from my marriage, I'd built a life centered on authenticity and mutual respect that felt so natural I sometimes forgot how exhausting it had been to constantly navigate Vivian's emotional manipulation and financial expectations during our 8 years together. My weekends now revolved around astronomy club meetings where Holly and I would set up our telescopes in dark sky areas outside the city, spending hours photographing distant galaxies and discussing everything from quantum physics to our shared plans for traveling to observe solar eclipses in remote locations around the world. These conversations felt effortless in ways my marriage never had, built on genuine curiosity and shared interests rather than the careful diplomatic negotiations I'd grown accustomed to when trying to discuss anything more complex than weekend restaurant choices with Vivian, who'd always seemed more interested in being entertained than in exploring ideas together. Ryan had become not just my gym buddy but a genuine friend who appreciated my straightforward personality and dry sense of humor, often joining Holly and me for dinners where we discuss everything from current events to philosophical questions without anyone checking their phone for social media validation or steering conversations back to workplace gossip and relationship drama. The community college networking program had led to opportunities I'd never imagined during my years as a basic security guard, with several classmates working in cybersecurity firms that were actively recruiting people with my combination of practical security experience and newly acquired technical skills, opening up career possibilities that could easily double my current salary within the next few years. My relationship with Holly had developed into something I'd never experienced before, a partnership where both people contributed equally, where conflicts were resolved through honest conversation rather than emotional manipulation, where planning for the future felt exciting rather than like a series of compromises designed to avoid triggering someone's insecurities about money or status or career advancement. She'd recently started talking about moving in together, not because of financial necessity or social pressure, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company and wanted to share daily experiences like cooking together, working on home improvement projects, and having the kind of quiet domestic routine that Vivian had always found insufferably boring. I received one final email from Vivian about 13 months after our divorce had been finalized, a carefully composed message that arrived on what would have been our 9th wedding anniversary, probably not a coincidence given her talent for dramatic timing and emotional manipulation. The email was a masterclass in selective memory and revisionist history, acknowledging that she'd made terrible choices while simultaneously minimizing the impact of those choices and hinting that I'd been equally responsible for our marriage's failure due to my work schedule and emotional unavailability, classic techniques for avoiding full accountability while appearing to take responsibility. She admitted that her relationship with Landon had been inappropriate but characterized it as a symptom of deeper problems in our marriage rather than a betrayal that had destroyed our trust, claimed she'd learned valuable lessons about communication and commitment, and suggested that we might be able to build something better if we both approached reconciliation with maturity and forgiveness. The email concluded with an invitation to meet for coffee so we could discuss our shared history and explore whether enough time had passed for us to consider giving our relationship another chance, framed as though this was a reasonable request from someone who'd demonstrated growth and deserved consideration rather than a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of choices she'd made when she thought she had better options available. I read the entire message twice, not because I was considering her proposal, but because I was genuinely fascinated by her ability to rewrite history in ways that minimized her responsibility while making her betrayal sound like a mutual communication failure that had affected us both equally. Instead of responding, I simply archived the email without reply, recognizing that closure comes from within rather than from external validation or explanations from people who demonstrated their fundamental inability to take responsibility for their actions. I'd learned that engaging with someone who'd proven willing to betray long-term commitments would only provide them with opportunities to manipulate my emotions and waste mental energy. I preferred to invest in building something positive with someone who actually deserved my trust and attention. That evening, Holly and I set up my telescope in the backyard of our shared house. She'd moved in 3 months earlier, focusing the lens on Saturn's rings while discussing our plans for a camping trip to observe the Perseid meteor shower the following month. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was literally exploring new horizons with someone who appreciated my curiosity and shared my sense of wonder, rather than dwelling on past disappointments or trying to rebuild damaged foundations with someone who'd already demonstrated their willingness to prioritize temporary excitement over lasting commitment. As we adjusted the telescope settings and marveled at the clarity of Saturn's atmospheric bands, I reflected on how my decisive action to leave immediately upon discovering Vivian's betrayal had saved me from months or years of attempting to rebuild trust with someone who'd emotionally checked out of our marriage long before I'd found evidence of her affair with Landon. The story of my marriage had ended exactly as it should have, with me recognizing my worth and refusing to accept treatment that fell below my standards, with me building a life based on honesty and mutual respect rather than trying to salvage something that had been fundamentally damaged by someone else's choices to prioritize temporary gratification over lasting partnership. And with me discovering that the right person would treasure the loyalty and commitment that Vivian had taken for granted until she'd thrown it away for workplace romance that had lasted exactly as long as her affair partner's career concerns had allowed.